Hello dear chess friends, my name is Marko Makaj. I am FIDE master from Croatia, and in our today lesson I will try to explain you some basic principle in a chess. Let's start and see what happens in our first main position. If you look at carefully, you'll see that I mark 4 squares on our chess table with green mark. These are square on e4, d4, d5 and e5. These are 4 central squares on this chess table. Now let's see why those 4 squares also are so important in our chess game. First, with white, we can try to play for those 4 squares, namely on 2 options. First option is to play e4, and with e4 we can control basically 2 squares. First square is e4 and the other square is on d5. If we go back and play here d4, we also control 2 main squares in the center. Now we control d4 and e5 square in the center of the board. If we go back and try to play something like e3, we need to see why this is worse move than e4. Now you can see that with move e3 we only control basically 1 square in the center. This is the square on d4. We can also see that in the future this bishop from c1 will be very difficult to play on some of the square like g5 because he doesn't have the square for this, and this pawn on e3 doesn't allow him to take the advantage of this square. So you can basically see that e4 or d4 are 2 main idea on the start of the chess game. So let's see what happens if we play e4. What you think can be the best answer of black? And also, if we go with some logic, you'll be able to see that if white wants to control the center, black is the side who doesn't allow him to do this. And if white play e4, the very best move for black will be e5. Playing e5 stop the advancing of moving this pawn from e4 and also try to take the control of 2 squares in the center. Now we can tell that black control e5 and d4 square. If we also here can play something else beside this e5, we namely can play something like e6. With this move, black also doesn't want to control the center, and with pawn on e6 he only controls the square d5. So eventually this bishop from c8, like the opponent's one on c1, will not be able so easy to play on this diagonal because this pawn on e6 doesn't allow him to do this. After e5, position in the center is very equal. Like we say, black control 2 squares and white also control those 2 squares. Now we go to second half of our today journey. This is the value of the piece. Value of the piece is very controlled, and it's very important also on the beginning of chess play. Why is so? Let's see what we can tell about this knight now on g1. This knight from g1 can now go on h3, f3 or e3. So we can tell that this knight now only can score 3 squares. Knight f3 is a very good move first because white also fight for the advantage and for the initiative in the center because he mainly attack two squares in the center. First, this pawn on e5, and also white support the square d4 for something like advancing the pawn later on. If we speak about the value of the position, when our knight is on g1, he only controls mainly 3 squares. Now, when we play our knight to f3, we can see that he can control much more square than on g1. With development of the knight, we can tell that we are better and that this knight goes on the better square and control more squares in the center and also some other square. Here we can see that this knight control 8 square. Basically, these are the squares on g1, e1, d2, d4, e5, g5 and h4. So this knight now control 8 square and is much more powerful than the knight from g1. Now black also needs to do something about his position, because now white push the pawn in the center, and with second move knight on e3 he wants to control the center later on. Namely, the best move for black is move knight c6. Like this knight on f3, this knight before goes on c6 control mainly only 2 squares. e4, e5, knight f3. Now we can see that this knight from b8 control only 2 squares. First square is on c6 and the other square is on a6. When we put our knight to c6, we not only to control this e5 square, we also control b4 square and 6 other square on the board. b4, a5, a7, b8, d8 and e7. This knight is now just like this knight on f3 developed, and he controls much of the squares on this chessboard. We can now go further and try to see how we can now try to take the initiative with white. Which squares we need to attack and how we can do this. Now we have one move with we can try to take the initiative in the center, because with bishop b5 we indirectly want to take this pawn on e5. Why so? Because this knight that defends this pawn on e5 is now attacked and need to be protected, or this pawn on e5 will fall and the white will establish clear advantage in the center. Now let's go back and see what happens with first move d4. Like in the first, when white play e4, black play e5 and try to take the control in the center. Here black can play d5, and namely he also can control 2 major squares in the center. This fight for the center squares now can go in the similar path, but a little bit different than the play with move e4. Here white is able to play move c4. With move c4, white also play for the attack in the center. Here with c4 we can see that he also attack the pawn on d5. Now if black takes this pawn, we can see that white with very next move e4 can basically control every square in the center. Now white sees very big initiative and has covered all 4 squares in the center of the chessboard. So this c4 move is very powerful, and the best way for black to play and try to hold on in this game and try to be very good in the center, he needs to protect this pawn on d5. He can do this on two separate ways, but the best way is to protect this pawn with the pawn. Why so? Let's see what happens if black try to protect this pawn with knight on f6. Now after taking this pawn and black taking this pawn, next move can be e4, and we now can see that this knight on d5 is attacked. He cannot be protected and he need to go away from this center square of d5. After knight b6, we also can see that our two pawns can control all four squares in the center of the board, and we can tell that white sees very big initiative in the center. So let's go back and see how black can protect his position. First, he can play something like move e6. This pawn on e6 control d5 square and doesn't allow white to take very serious advantage in the center. If now, let's say white take on d5, after taking with e pawn, we also have very symmetrical position in the center, and our pawn on d5 control also two squares like the white pawn on d4. White doesn't want to allow black to control this center so easy, and that's why he also wants to bring his first piece into play. Knight c3 is a very good move because not only to develop the knight, he also try to expose this threat in the center with taking later on d5. Now we can see that pawn on c4 and knight on c3 try to seize the initiative in the center. Like in the first advice, we also can try to do here something like knight f6. With this knight on f6, we also control this d5 square and doesn't allow white to take the initiative and to take the advantage in the center. We can see now that white mainly has only one pawn in the center, and this is the pawn on d4, and only square else that he controls is the square on e5. And just like this, we have here the pawn on d5 that control d5 square, and after this we also control the square on e4. So white and the black are equal in the center. And with this we can tell that white and black are close to equal in this game. White have a little bit advantage because he has more space and maybe a little bit more active pieces, but black scored his goal and he eventually managed to stay very confident in the center, and this play in the center is very equal. Now, beside this play in the center, what we else need to do and need to see now is some major value of the piece. And when I tell value of the piece, why and what is this? So let's go back for the initial chess position, and it's very important to know the value of the piece and see the realistic picture of who is better and worse, and to play according to this later on. Because as the game progresses, value of the piece is changing, and we can say that comes to the relative value of those pieces. And by that I mean, if you look now at this chessboard, you will see that this knight on g1 relatively doesn't value much because he only can score two squares, namely those squares are f3 and h3. But later on with the development, if we put this knight, let's say on c3, now this knight controls much more squares than the knight from g1. This means that we need to develop the piece and try also to go with those pieces as quickly as we can into play. And also these pieces, as more as they play in the center, they are more attackingly. They have more squares and more rooms to play later on. When you play with white color, then you always want to try to seize the initiative on the beginning of the chess play, and that's why you have little bit more squares and little bit more rooms to play. For black, the goal is to try to survive and try to stay very comfortable in the center and try to develop the pieces on the very best squares.